Hey everyone, Nick Berlin with Berlin Builds. Today I'm going to show you how to put together this rustic walnut and white oak cutting board. Alright, the first step that I'm going to do with this long piece of rustic walnut is I'm going to plane it down. Just going to kind of do a few little skim coats just to clean it up. So one of the reasons why I ran the whole board through the planer first was to eliminate as much snipe as I can off of the board. Now what snipe is when your board is running through a planer, usually at the front or the back, the board's gonna tip slightly and it's gonna plane off a little bit more material. You can actually see that right here. I have this line, this is a snipe mark. Now, you can go through and adjust your planer and do all these little tweaks to get rid of the snipe. I just never have. Typically what I do though, is on the end of a board, a lot of times I cut off a lot of it because a lot of it's cracked. So for me, I just run the whole board through, and a lot of times when I cut off the snipe, I've just cut off all the cracks too. Now, if you were to cut all these to your rough cut, say like I'm gonna be cutting mine about 30 inches long. If I went and cut all these things rough and then planed them all down, I get snipe on each end of those shorter boards, and I need to be trimming that off. So by doing it on the big long piece, I only have 2 sections of snipe to cut off. One thing that you need to look for is cracks on the edges. You can see right here, we've got this one. It's probably about, 1.5 inches or so. And then typically what you can do is if you go about 1 inch past the crack, that will usually cut out most of it. And what you can do is check your offcut. And if you can just rip it in half and it just breaks right along that crack line, you probably need to trim off a little bit more. So somewhere between the 2.5 and 3 inch mark is what we need to cut off of this board. And you can see how it's cutting off this line of snipe here at the same time. Typically, when you're able to snap something like that in half, it means you need to trim a little bit more off of your board to get rid of a little bit more of that crack. Now I'm going to rough cut my boards to about 32 inches long. Since we have a nice flat face, what I'm going to do now is create a perfectly flat and square edge from this face using the joiner. The reason that you want that is it's going to make it a lot easier when we're ripping these strips down on the table saw to make it so they're nice and straight. The next thing that you need to do is decide how wide you're going to rip these strips. Now, the width that you're ripping your strips is going to really affect the thickness of your cutting board. Not only really affect, but will affect. This is how you're deciding how thick your cutting board is going to be. So if you want your cutting board to be 1 inch thick, you need to rip these strips more than 1 inch wide because you're going to have to plane some of that material down. So in this case, I think I'm going to go about 1 1/8 inches in my width, and that will leave me with about 5 pieces with just a little bit of scrap left over. Now that I have all my strips ripped down, what I need to do is just kind of start playing with how these fit together and see how I want this cutting board to line up. You can see I've got like a bow right here. I've got a few pieces that are kind of a little chewed up where it's gonna be a lot easier if I start placing some of those on the side that's gonna get ripped off, or if I just cull a board and just pull it out all together. What I've done here is I've laid out all my pieces how I want them to be, except for a couple of decorative pieces I'll show you in a second. And what I'm looking for is I've dry fitted them, right? So I've clamped them without any glue, and I'm looking for any really large gaps. And this is actually a really tight board, except for right here. I have a gap that just won't close no matter how much pressure I put. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take these 2 pieces back to the joiner, and I'm going to rejoint these 2 faces to help them close it, to help them just play nicer with each other. So I've got them marked, just what makes sense to me. And then another thing that I did off camera is I had a scrap piece of white oak. So I ripped 2 pieces of white oak, really skinny, about 1/8 of an inch. I did the same thing with a little piece of walnut. And these are going to go right about here in the cutting board. I think that's going to look nice, right about there, a little offset. After jointing those 2 pieces together, we've really cleaned up that gap and makes us a lot tighter. And you can see I put the 2 little strips of white oak in with a little piece of walnut filler. I think it's just gonna look good. I'm debating, I might keep it here or I might switch it over one more. I'm not sure which one I like better. Another thing that you just need to be aware of while you guys are doing these things is just the orientation of the grain pattern of each piece. If you have them all going the same way, eventually your cutting board is going to want to bow like this. But when you alternate your grain pattern, when one tries to cut like this and the other one tries to cut, oh boy, can't do it very good, like this. Like this, see how you start to go like this and then like this? By alternating it, it's going to help your cutting board stay flatter over the long term. All right, I'm ready to glue up. I'm gonna be using Titebond 3. This is waterproof, according to the bottle. I'm not sure if I believe it's waterproof, at least it's water resistant, but this is gonna get washed and it's gonna get rinsed, so you want a glue that's gonna hold up to water. So that's why I go with Titebond 3. You wanna make sure you get glue spread nice and even across all of these different surfaces. So there's two different ways that you can go here. You can wipe up all the glue with a wet rag, or you can just leave it and let it all dry, and then you just scrape and plane it all off. I've done both ways. I usually just leave it because maybe I'm just lazy, but I'm not gonna flip this thing over and start wiping down the other side. So either way, I'm scraping. So I just kind of leave it. Sometimes I'll scrape, I scrape just a little bit where it was getting a little tacky, but yeah, do what you want, but I'm just leaving it. Once you let them set for a couple hours, it's all right to take them out of the plant. Especially if your wife's van needs to get parked back in the garage. So I'm gonna take these out. Some of the surface glue is, like if I got down into it, it wouldn't be dry. So I'm not gonna run it through my planer until it's all really, really dry, but it's dry enough that I can pull it off. All right, now that this glue's all set, I'm just gonna scrape off some of it and start planing it down. Now that the cutting board's all planed down, I'm just gonna cut it to length. You can measure it and make it be exactly how long you want it to be. The way that I typically do is I just try and make it as big as it can be. So I'm just gonna cut so all these little random parts are all off of the board, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. One thing to be aware of though is when you cut here, don't flip the board like this and then cut, because it might pull it out a square, because this line and this line might not be parallel with each other. So make sure that once you make your cut, just slide it down and cut off of the same side. And then what we'll do after that is we're gonna rip this side on the fence to make it match. Now that we've got the two ends squared off, now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rip off this side just to make it so it's in plane, or so I should say parallel with this. You can be picky here, like I've got this little knot. You could rip that off. I think it adds some character to the board, so I'm gonna leave it. But if you want to, once you've ripped this side, you can flip the board and re-rip this other side to just kind of clean up that edge if you're wanting that. For your edges, what you can do is you can use a router and you can give it a profiled edge. I'm gonna use a tiny little quarter round and pretty much just make an eased edge. You can just hand sand it. There's a lot of different options. I just like doing it this way. All right, next is sanding, because it's everyone's favorite part. What you can do is a lot of times you can start out like about a 180, then go up to a 220, and then finish off about 320. If you have a 400 grit, even better. One thing that you need to remember to do though is I'll take it to about 220 and then I'll go get the whole board wet and I'll let it dry for about 30-40 minutes, maybe even an hour, go do something else. And what that does is by letting it dry, the grains, if you can imagine my fingers being the grain of the wood, it'll start to, by getting it wet, those grains will start to raise up. And then that's how you get kind of that fuzzy feeling in wood. Like a popsicle stick that's wet, kind of feels fuzzy, that's when the grain has popped. So if you go and sand this all nice and smooth and then you oil it, and when you go and wash it, after you've went and cut up an onion and cried your eyes out, you're gonna get kind of a fuzzy feeling on the cutting board. And it won't ever feel quite as smooth as when you first sanded it. So by letting that grain raise up, what happens is once you sand that grain off, it won't raise back up because you've already destroyed it. It's gone, so it'll always stay smooth. So I like to go 180, then 220, get it wet, let it dry, and then I'll sand it at 220 again, and I'll go to like about 320, and then that's when you put on your finish. Once you have it all sanded, so you get it wet, you let it dry, and then you sand it all again, you're gonna get a really smooth finish. What I like to use for cutting boards is a mixture of beeswax and mineral oil. You can buy it pre-mixed. This is a Howard brand butcher block conditioner. It's a food grade mineral oil and the beeswax, like I said. I'll link to where you can buy this in the description below, or you can just usually buy it at a local hardware store. But what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna take this, and you're gonna wanna be very generous with this stuff. And I really just try and rub it in really hard. That way you kind of almost, I don't know, grind or melt the wax into it, something like that. But be very generous. We've got a paper towel, and then you just kind of start rubbing. When it comes to the end grain, this is where you're going to be soaking up more of the oil. So I try and be very generous with the oil and the wax on these end grains. And you're going to want to put a couple of different coats right here. And the great thing about this is you can just reapply it whenever the board starts to look a little dry or a little thirsty. You can always just get out a bottle and rub a little bit more on. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can see more videos like this. We've got about 50-ish plus videos out right now on different fun things, so make sure you check those out. And then comment below if you have any questions on the build, or if you have any really good dad jokes or inspirational stories that involve cheese. I'm open to all of these different things. Make sure you hit that like button, and I'll see you on the next one.